I'd love for you to share a little bit about your background growing up and your journey to where you are today.
Well, we only have, an hour?
Yeah.
The entire hour talking about my childhood, but it's my parents had immigrated here first in the early 60s, like 1960. My dad was a mature student at U of T, and mature students nowadays, you don't think twice. He was 32. And back in the 60s, though, that was old. Go to U of T, but he had an opportunity to do it and study electrical engineering and met my mom at a Chinese student union dance. They were married at Hart House. And
Oh,
those
wow.
that know University of Toronto,
Yeah.
Hart House is beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful place. And I was recently there going, oh, this is where my parents got married. And there's a little courtyard and there's a little chapel inside there. So a lot of memories, local memories at U of T. But growing up, my parents, I have an older sister and a younger brother, but we were the only Asian family in Agincourt. Now, those of you in Toronto will kind of go, no, it's Agincourt. Everyone knows Agincourt as Agincourt because today in 2021, it's largely populated by Asians and Southeast Asians. But back in the early 70s, we were the only ethnic minority in this new subdivision in Scarborough. Going to school all the way through, I had one other Asian friend or non-white friend the entire time. Those that grew up in that environment, like daughters, sons of immigrants, we tried our best to fit in. We tried to integrate. We became Canadian. I played hockey. I thought I was going to go be the first Chinese Canadian in the NHL. I sound white, but I don't look white. But I concealed that Asianness for many, many years until just a couple of years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, when my kids started to age and we were deciding what to do. So guess what? They're doing Mandarin school. We eat a lot of Asian food. We go to Asian grocery stores. We've really embraced that culture. But growing up as a young kid, I did my best to hide my dumpling lunches. Everyone else had peanut butter and jam sandwiches. I wanted that, but I got dumplings. I had those little rice, steamed rice and lotus leaves for lunch. And I used to be embarrassed. As times evolved, and there was a huge influx of Hong Kong immigrants with the Chinese takeover in the mid to late 90s. Agincourt became Agincourt. My friends shifted to from largely white to largely Asian. Just as I started to get more into my identity as a Chinese Canadian, I go to the East Coast, to Dalhousie University to do my undergraduate degree in very classic Asian undergraduate, pre-med kind of life sciences. And there again, Halifax is an amazing city, very diverse now, not so much then. And again, I'm one of the few Asians there, one of the only visible minorities playing varsity sports. So I swam varsity there. And again, hid my Asianness there. Before going to McMaster for my master's in business administration, but more of the same. Corporate Canada, more of the same. Consulting firms, you don't see Asians on the management consulting side. Stereotypically, you would see Asians on the audit, tax, accounting side. I hit it. I played the sort of corporate game, learned a lot. And then more recently, as I mentioned, with children and in leadership positions in healthcare, I've started to become very aware of my skin color and about role models, there are very few Asian leaders in publicly funded health, with the exception of Asian-specific organizations that have Asian leaders. But if you look at the broader healthcare sector, I can count on one hand the number of Asian CEOs, EVPs, VPs, non-clinical. So again, stereotypically, a lot of Asian doctors. Very Asian thing to do as a parent, to have your kids become physicians. It's an honorable profession. And the black sheep of the family, not being a physician, I come from a family of physicians, I was over here. But to not see a lot of role models there, it was very jarring. Some of the things that I think about diversity now, beyond Asian too, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, so BIPOC, I can relate. In a certain way. It's a different perspective than a BIPOC with lived experience. But in recent years, I've started to relate to their experiences and made it my passion now to get myself educated, to promote BIPOC healthcare leaders and non-clinical positions, to mentor them, to participate in podcasts like this, and to really show that there are BIPOC leaders in healthcare. So, in a nutshell.
Everything that you said resonates so much with me. That whole piece of identity. As a child, you just want to fit in. You want to be like everyone else. I grew up in India, as I mentioned to you, so I actually did not have any other Asian friends who looked like me. There were times when I questioned why my eyes were so small, or friends would say, can you close your eyes and sleep? Like, how do you sleep? Like those kinds of silly questions. Then you start questioning your identity. And it's not until now that, you're more mature, that you actually start appreciating the person you are and all that you bring from the different cultural experiences. And I completely resonate with everything that you've said. And I'm curious to know, like, how do you identify yourself today?
Yeah, I call myself Chinese Canadian and he, him. I never used to call myself Chinese Canadian. And that's what I am. My parents are Chinese, my wife's Chinese, my kids are Chinese, we're Chinese Canadian. I really started to get more involved in Chinese Canadian history. I was vaguely aware of the Chinese head tax, the recent apology, the leaders in the Chinese community who got that apology from the federal government a couple of years ago. They looked into how Chinatowns have evolved in Canada. There's I think it was Stephen Leacock, one of the famous Canadian authors, said every single town in Ontario has a Main Street, Queen Street, King Street, and a Chinese laundry. And a Chinese restaurant, right? And there's a sort of a migratory path of immigrants that have come to Canada to work on the National Railroad, an institution that has united our country, and gone off to smaller communities to be productive citizens of this country. And so reflecting on our ancestors who moved here and worked to unify the country, it makes me even feel more pride, more sense of belonging to that Chinese Canadian community. And so I do feel it's my obligation to give back. And I know it sounds very cliche, but to be a leader, to participate, to inspire, to engage, so that others become more aware of the challenges our ancestors faced. And moving beyond Chinese Canadian, it's also BIPOC. So I've learned a lot about Black history outside of Black History Month, right? It's like not a 1 month thing. It's like it's a thing that I'm trying to understand myself, the history of slavery, the Underground Railroad to Canada, and one of the stops being the Kensington Market, which is just outside my facility here. And there's a street called Augusta Avenue where an organization sits right on top. It's the heart of Kensington Market. It's named after James Augusta, who was the first Black medical graduate from the University of Toronto in the 1800s. He was trained here, served the Black poor population of the market, which was known as the Ward. It was the slums of Toronto at the time. Went back to the US and fought in the Civil War and became the United States' first Black Surgeon General. And he was trained right here. So little tidbits like that really inspires me that our diverse population, whether it's a BIPOC or Asian or whatever, there's a footprint here in Canada. And I think that is what makes this country great and different from other countries around the world. It's not to say we're without challenges. We do have our own challenges. And that's part of the reason why I'm talking to you.
Yeah. And how different do you think it is now for your children growing up versus when you were growing up?
Well, we'll see when they hit the teenage years.
Yeah.
Like I went to Chinese school. I hated it. went to Chinese Sunday school, and I regret it. I regret not taking that time. But when you're 14, 15, your friends are going to high school dances on Friday night, you're going to Chinese school, right? Or you got another school function on a Sunday, but you got to go to dim sum with your family because it's a thing. Sundays are family days in Chinese household, meals, and other cultures as well, not just Chinese. So there's a sense of resentment as a teenager. And I think my children are young enough now where, as I mentioned, they do learn Mandarin. They Skype to China or so FaceTime or whatever to China, to Beijing. So they have native Mandarin speakers. They don't fight it anymore. They used to when they're kids, just know they have to do it. They see the importance of it, given that they walk around the city. There are people that look like them, that they speak. Our lives outside of healthcare are mainly in the Asian community. So there's a lot of their peer group that they interact with, which you and I didn't have that opportunity necessarily growing up. So it's much more pervasive, much more where you can get around the city now without speaking a lick of English. You can speak Mandarin or Cantonese and you'll be just fine. You can go to a grocery shop, you can go to the bank, you can go to a physician, you can go to a restaurant, get your hair cut. You can do all the daily things without ever speaking English. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, and you said you now call yourself Chinese Canadian. What did you call yourself previously?
Canadian. When I traveled abroad too, they go, "Where are you from?" I go, "Canada." And there was a sort of look of, "Yeah, well, you're not white." And well, look Canadian, look, I'm Asian. But I'm Canadian.